Welcome to the library. Thank you so much for coming out. We are super excited to be hosting Connecticut State Archaeologist, Dr. Brian Jones, whom I confess I've desperately wanted to call Dr. Jones all week. It's like the perfect name. I'm sure you've never heard that before.
What are you talking about?
Oh, yeah, what are you talking about? If I call you Indy later, don't worry about me. But we are really delighted to have this as part of our Archaeology Week programming. On February 5th, next Thursday, we will also be inviting Marilyn Johnson, who is an author who has just written a new book. She's going to be here for Authors on Stage. Her title is Lives in Ruins, and it's all about the profession of archaeology and what it really means to have that as your job. It's fascinating, and Dr. Jones here has said that he thought it was well done. So if you like programs like these, if you like being able to connect with really knowledgeable people in our community, in your backyard, in your library, please consider a donation to our programming fund. We have a little donation box in the back, and I'm the programming librarian here. My name is Erin Page. I promise to be a good steward of your funds and bring you more cool stuff like this. So without further ado, Dr. Brian Jones.
All right, thanks, Erin. I guess that sounds like it's working pretty well, right? Good, good. Well, thanks for coming out. It's a huge crowd. It's nice to see so many people interested in archaeology. It interests the heck out of me, but I'm an archaeologist, so I always, expect it to be the most exciting thing in the world. So I'm always pleased when the public says, hey, what's going on and what's this about, and is it actually happening in my backyard? So what I want to talk about today is the fact that, sure, archaeology is happening across the state of Connecticut. We're just having some discussions about how much archaeology has gone on in New Canaan, and it's not much, but nearby areas like New Milford are full of sites. When there aren't many sites documented in your town, it only means there's probably not local regulations in place protecting those sites in construction. Sites are generally protected through federal and state level regulatory mechanisms. I'm not going to go on this too long here. But it's up to you guys at the grassroots level to promote those kind of protective measures for each municipality. So I encourage you guys, check the local zoning regulations and see if anything's in place. And it's not ask. What we often like to do, and my office is here to do that, work with local planning departments and try to help them develop some regulatory mechanisms to help preserve sites. In other words, just to send a couple archaeologists out to the field first and see if something's there before the next big giant box place goes in and just wrecks the landscape. All right, so today I'm going to talk about 5 things that for me are the most sort of critical themes in Connecticut and New England archaeology in general. And I'm going to just stick them up here. I promise not to do too many sort of bullety things, but now and then they kind of help. These are what I would consider broad anthropological themes. Archaeologists are all anthropologists. That's what you have to go to school to study, is really anthropology. And we are concerned with the human animal and trying to understand it better. And Connecticut is one of many, many laboratories, archaeological laboratories, for trying to do that. And so these are things that come to mind when I think about Connecticut archaeology that I think information from our region is capable of answering. These are big questions that archaeologists around the world deal with. And so I want to make sure we try to put Connecticut on the map a little bit, because we have a chance to look at these issues. And in some ways, asking questions about, say, the adoption of agricultural ways of life happened in New England only 1,000 years ago, whereas people get their NSF grants to go out to the Near East and study these things where they happened 10,000 years ago, and it's an exciting, cool place to work. But the truth is, that transition happened here at a much more recent time, and the record's actually that much less destroyed. It hasn't been buried for so long. So, we need to kind of take pride and take ownership of some of these research directions. So I want to look at what I call the true colonization in New England. Most of us in this room who aren't of Native American ancestry are biased when we think about colonization and moving into this part of the country, we think of our own ancestors who got here only about 400 years ago. But Native Americans got here 13,000 years ago and were extremely successful in establishing their way of life in this area without the help of a local indigenous population. I think most of us kind of have the message that our Pilgrim forefathers would not have fared well without a lot of hand-holding by the Native Americans of this region. They did not have that advantage, and they survived incredibly well. We'll see that a little bit. Another theme that's important to me, dear to my heart, both those time periods, the colonization phase and this adaptation to the post-glacial landscapes, to climate change, are dear to my heart because that's kind of what my own dissertation was focused on. The prior state archaeologist, Nick Bellantoni, who hopefully most of you guys have seen before, a wonderful speaker, a great storyteller, he was really interested in human bones and anatomy and looking at all that cool stuff about dead people. I'm really interested in how people around the world have adapted to the shift in climate from the Ice Age to sort of the modern era of more temperate climates that we're in now that started about 10,000 years ago. New England, again, is an amazing place to look at that change. And in fact, it's over a decade ago now. It's getting to be about 15 years ago. We found a remarkable site on the Mashantucket Pequot Reservation, and I'll talk about a little bit, that totally blew our minds and changed the way we thought about this time period. Another important topic is the development of what I call formal exchange systems. And we'll get into that a little bit more. I'm going to spend most of the time today on those first two things. I'm just going to warn you that now, again, because they're nearest and dearest to my heart. And some of these other things we actually have a little less information on. But formal exchange systems are kind of the beginning of complex relationships between communities that anchor themselves in sort of ritualized, regular get-togethers where things are exchanged, and often, in the case that we'll talk about for this region, special items that are manufactured for these occasions probably are then placed with the dead in the ground. We see this rural elaboration happen about 3,500 years ago in our region. And what is that? What kind of hints is that telling us and giving us about the way people live and the strategies that they're taking politically to deal with one another in a much more populated landscape? Prior to this time, especially dealing with the Ice Age, there was barely anyone living here. There was not a lot of competition over resources. That's changing by that period. And we see formalized exchange systems probably as a response to that. What I call enhanced food processing inventions happen around 3,000 years ago, 3,500. Around that same time, we see the formal exchange networks developing, and that's probably not a coincidence that these things are linked together. People, because of population increase, are forced to get more food from the same amount of land as they're living in kind of tighter communities with more people in them. In the PaleoIndian period, you could walk from the Connecticut shoreline to Lake Champlain and up into northern Maine as part of your annual round and always get yourself to the place where the most food was during the year. As we move forward in time, that's just less and less possible because someone else is living where you wanted to go to get that food. And they wanted to claim that, those food resources. So how did people deal? They basically start incorporating these specialized food processing technologies. And finally, a lot of this is sort of setting the stage for the development of socio-economically and socio-politically complex societies. And when most of us think of the Algonquin groups that inhabited Connecticut and most of New England, we think of them as, pretty small-scale societies, not necessarily living, say, even like the Iroquois in their large longhouses and these big palisaded villages. With a very formal kind of council of 50 leaders that would get together regularly and discuss things in a very strongly clan-based system. We had something different going on here. And then as you get out into the Midwest, there's places like the Cahokia site. I don't know if any of you have been there, where you've got an urban center at the same time. 20,000 people living in Illinois near the Mississippi River. So we have these different levels of complexity, but does that mean the Algonquin societies were in some way less complex? Were they more simple? I would argue that they were not, and that they were making certain choices based on their own cultural values. So let's move ahead, kind of setting the stage. before people got to New England and shortly before they got here, it looked something like this. Let me look for my pointer. Let's see if I got it. All right, let me rummage in here. What usually happens is the batteries run out and I'm sure too many things in here except this magic box. Let's see if the button's going to work. Okay, good. So here's New England. The black outline is the modern kind of state outlines and things like that. A few things jump out right away. Let's look at the shoreline. This is very different. What the heck's going on here? Here's Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket. There's this giant area of land sticking out into the Atlantic. Okay. Nova Scotia's got a lot more land mass to it as well. This is the result of about 300 feet of lowering of the sea level because all that water was tied up in glacial ice. What the funny thing is that despite sea level was so much lower, the midsection of kind of lowland central Maine is underwater. And the reason for that is because this massive ice here is still putting so much weight on the continent that it's pressing that area down below that 300 feet and actually flooding it. So if there were coastal sites from this period, they would be over here, and if there's coastal sites in southern New England, they're off deep down off the continental shelf somewhere, and we just don't even know about them. The other thing that you should notice, well, we've got our glacial barrier here. That's the edge of the glacial mass, all right, as it's retreating slowly. We've also got these large glacial lakes. This is the remnants of Glacial Lake Hitchcock. Shortly before this time, it extended down into central Connecticut and drained all the way at Rocky Hill and drained out. By this time, it really kind of receded up into northern New England. And Glacial Lake Albany, a massive, massive body of water. These are very cold freshwater lakes, probably devoid of life, probably not teeming with fish. And it didn't last especially long. And so, arguably parts of these did last like 4,000 years. And this may be giving out. It never does. It never makes it. Oh well. And at the bottom you can see Glacial Lake Connecticut. That's filling our modern day Long Island Sound. Again, a big freshwater body of water. Very different than the environment we're used to thinking of today. So this is kind of setting the stage for people to sort of first enter this region and what they were looking at. Very different environment. Just a couple hundred years later, we have, it's changing. We lost Glacial Lake Albany. Glacial Lake Hitchcock is really drained out by this time. We see at the Connecticut, the entire Long Island Sound area is largely, there's a big river running through it, so it doesn't show on this little map, but it's basically a big sandy plain. The waters are starting to kind of sweep in off Block Island Sound there. And Maine is now close to its normal coast. It's actually rebound enough that the shoreline is now off the modern shore. And in the north, there is a giant saltwater sea, Glacial Lake Champlain. And this sea had walrus in it. It had beluga whales and things like that. There was a lot of big animals. And that area was also part of the northern flyway of all the geese and other waterfowl that start to enter this region. So this is probably the landscape that the first colonists found. It's likely that they came in, we know they came in basically from the western-southwestern direction. That's the only way to get here. They didn't come down in over the ice somehow. And despite some popular television shows suggesting they might have jumped over from France, there's still no indication that that's true. So we'll leave that out of the picture for now. The real story is probably, I think, much more interesting than that one. We have people in, say, eastern Pennsylvania region, where we've got Jasper quarries. Kind of highlight that first one here in eastern Pennsylvania. And then there's folks that are probably starting to move into the Hudson Valley region, where we've got I'm going to focus a little bit on these rock sources. These were sort of the most important sources for raw material to make the stone tools that everyone needed. And they kind of form a nice hopscotch pattern into New England. So there's some black lines on this map, and I borrowed this from another publication from Artspiece and another archaeologist. He's the state archaeologist in Maine who's very interested in this time period and has done so far the best job at presenting this kind of visual information. The truth is, let's do our hopscotch here first. We've got Vermont, beautiful white fine-grained quartzites, and as we move up into New Hampshire, we run into these lovely kind of orange banded rhyolites, also a very workable stone. Some of the most sought-after material ends up that it comes from northern Maine at the Munsunnon Lake region, and this is a beautiful banded red and green chert, probably given some attention simply because of its colors. There seems to have been a preference for bright, colorful chert, and chert is a glassy, flint-like rock, right? As we move forward in time, eventually, and it's not too much after this area becomes settled, parts of Nova Scotia are producing cherts and chalcedonies, and then on the Gaspé Peninsula, we've got some really nice raw materials too. In New England, you do not find glassy cherts everywhere. They tend to be kind of localized, and the stuff that you really need to make good tools is kind of limited in its distribution across the landscape. It turns out these areas, these locations for toolstone were found pretty early. So it suggests that people just didn't run out here and start using whatever was available locally. They had time to explore this region and get to know its resources. I think probably for centuries. And if we want to back up a second and try to figure out how people got here, and this is really getting down to that colonization process, it's a question of human demography and population, and how many people you need in a group to sustain a population over a period of time. It turns out people, like most large mammals, including animals like bears, need about at least 250 people in a group to maintain a viable breeding population. If you get much below that, chance and other problems mean you're not going to find an appropriate mate, accidents happen, storms happen, people die off, and it's very easy for the population to go extinct. If we think about pandas or other kind of animals at the limits, you get below 250, people get very worried about them. So humans had to deal with this as they expanded their range out into unknown areas. So what we can imagine is that a group of, say, that minimum population arrives in the central Mohawk Valley area of New York, and they have access to some good toolstone. There's probably caribou. We'll talk about caribou a little bit. And they kind of set up and start exploring and really utilizing that area of upstate New York. So 250 people. Now their population is going to grow. Populations don't always grow, but we know from the expansion of these PaleoIndian period groups that they were very successful on the landscape. And we ask and debate, like, how fast did the population grow? Let's just say, on average, it took 300 or 500 years for that population to double to 500, at which point they were able to divide themselves and then move on to a new territory. That's enough time. Say you need 100 or 200 years just to get settled in, right? So I'm living in the central Mohawk Valley. We're getting to know the resources. Everything's great. Our population grows over time, and we feel comfortable enough there that, hey, let's send, Joe and Fred are going to go we're going to go over that Hudson River, that really big river, and see what's over there. There is a sense maybe, hey, our population's getting bigger and there's, fewer resources available. Let's just go see what's over the river. So they do. They start sending out parties and exploring into the area that we now call New England. They look for rock sources. They're very carefully looking for game paths and watching where the caribou herds are moving through. They're watching where the waterfowl are flying and figuring out where their nesting areas are. They've got probably 200 years to do this. So it's not just Fred and Joe, it's their sons and their sons' sons, and maybe a few women now and then who were adventurous and joined them. This tends to be a male thing, this exploration stuff. I don't want to be sexist, but it's sort of just the anthropology of it. They're the ones you can lose. That's why. I mean, guys, you can kill most of them off. It doesn't matter, because as long as you got women in your group, it only takes a couple guys to make a lot of babies. All right? It's just the way it works. It's sad, but that's the way it is. So guys are expendable, whether it's warfare or the dangers of exploration. Men are pretty expendable. So they would offer this. And it's a way to get prestige, though. And although these are egalitarian societies, most people have the same status in society. It doesn't mean you couldn't shoot for greater prestige than your neighbor socially. There's a little balance there that happens. Okay, so this is how we start to envision this process. After the population of the homeland has reached about that 500 person point, some of those explorers who now know this area, they know it from stories, the places have been named, they tell stories around the campfires every night, they know that new region really well after a few hundred years. Some of them are going to go and start to set up a permanent camp and see how things go. They're going to bring their family. But to survive, they've got to convince half of that population back at home to join them. And again, there's a lot to be gained by those very first explorers who are going to take the risk to go into the new territory. The resources are going to be much more abundant. They're not as hunted out. And there's that advantage of social prestige you gain by being the first in the new area, knowing the most and telling the stories and being able to tell people where they're going to get stuff. Your status is going to improve in society. And that's a big draw, no doubt. But it took some charismatic people to convince like half that local population to move out. But basically, somehow this process worked. By about 12,800 or so years ago, and what I should add, I'm using what we call calibrated radiocarbon years. That is real years. All right, these are the actual years ago. When you get a radiocarbon date from this time period, it would be about, say, 10,800 years ago. For the PaleoIndian period, you have to add about 2,000 years to turn that into an actual date. So the actual date for this first transition and first colonization is about 12,800 or so years ago. The projectile points that these guys, the spear points that these folks leave behind, are the most similar to the Clovis type that you may have heard about, that occur really, the true Clovis type occurs primarily in the southeastern U.S. and out west. As you get into the Great Lakes in New England, it's kind of a variant. And what happens is everything's about this is right. See, this is the flute that's been removed to fin it for hafting. The Clovis point only comes up about this far. These are being manufactured with this deeper stripe. It's a stylistic thing, really, but it's a little bit, it's showing off a bit. It shows some very accomplished abilities, and it's something that really only starts happening. There's every reason to believe this happens around 10,800 years ago, whereas Clovis is about, again, radiocarbon years, this is my head talking, 11,000, say 13,000 years ago. It's just a difference of a couple hundred years, and these subtle stylistic changes start to occur. So these sites are really focused mostly in southern New England. Now notice there's not much happening in Connecticut at this time that we are currently aware of. There's about 50 fluted points known from the state, but only a few sites, and the sites that have been excavated professionally, it's like 3 of those. And they tend to date later than this phase. So we're missing that colonial phase from Connecticut still. It's certainly out there somewhere. My guess is most of it's out on Long Island Sound, though. That's where the caribou herds are probably hanging out most of the time. What we have left in Connecticut is the uplands and the interior forested area. It was just not as attractive as the Sound would have been, this great grassy plain full of caribou. Probably their calving grounds, I'm thinking. So one of the exceptions is the Israel River Complex. Up in New Hampshire, that's a place I've had the opportunity to do excavations for about 12 years with Dick Bovair, who's the state archaeologist there. He has now, I don't know, at least a dozen Paleo-Indian sites, some of which date to this early phase. And it turns out that this is along Route 2 in New Hampshire, north of the White Mountains. It's sort of the natural path across north of the mountains. It's where the railroad line goes. It's where the modern main road of Route 2 cuts across if you're going between the Connecticut River and I think it's the Androscoggin River up in Maine. This has got to have been the main path that caribou herds were taking across the valley to get down into the Connecticut Valley, and then they may have moved all the way down to Long Island Sound at this time. So if people are up north seasonally, but they're probably kind of hunkered in the Connecticut Valley region and up into bits of northern New Hampshire at this time. It didn't take long for these guys to expand their population out. And again, we see a subtle change in the projectile points over another couple hundred-year period, where in the more northern regions, and that's up at the DeBert site in Nova Scotia, the Vale site up in northwestern Maine, I think it's called the Magalawi River system there, because there's a number of little sites. But the Vale site is a famous one. This type of deeply indented-based straight-sided point also shows up in to a degree in northern New York State. So there's a kind of a northern phenomena and culture group forming, and in southern New England, we're getting these little guys on the right that are most famous from the Bull Brook site in eastern Massachusetts, where there was a big encampment, probably a caribou hunting encampment. They had about 12 families. Well, I shouldn't say that. There was up to 40 pit concentrations. So depending on how many times they revisited the site, there may have been even 40 families at that site at one time who are making little projectile points like the one on the right. They're a little bit smaller. They start to have a little bit of a fishtail to them. Stylistically, they're setting themselves apart from the other points in the northern region. So we can say by this time there's probably two sort of culture areas already developing, even during the Paleo-Indian period. So these are interesting things that the archaeologists like to track and debate. Basically, the long and short of it is these folks were very, very successful. Population density was still very low. There may have only been 500 people in southern New England and 500 people up to the north, but they had really settled in. And there's a whole other phase after that that we could get into where the stuff is like all over the place, but we're going to kind of pass over that. That entire phase of colonization occurred during a glacial transition period known as the Younger Dryas period. It was actually a cold snap. The ice age had been slowly kind of tapering away, and the climate was actually getting much nicer. During the exploration phase before that, you know, the climate was actually fairly mild. Oak trees were starting to show up in southern New England. But everything reversed during that colonization phase, and perhaps might have even promoted the colonization of New England. We think today that cold is a terrible mess and we hate it and it makes our energy costs go up and everything else to keep our houses warm, and we're sick of bundling up on days like this. But if you are a caribou hunter in New England, you want cold winters. These extreme cold near glacial conditions are opening up the forests so that you've got tundra areas, big broad expanses of kind of northern grasslands that are open. You've got in the mid parts of New England open spruce forests that sort of protect the herds. You've got closed canopy forests in southern New England that again provide shelter probably in the deep winter. And what I believe anyway is along Long Island Sound during those low glacial period water tables, you've got the big expanse of sandy, probably grasslands and maybe some pines or spruce, where the herds probably calved. In other words, in the springtime when they would go there to have their calves, and then they kind of migrate all the way up into northern New England. Is it likely that these herds are moving between Maine and even southern New England and the coastal parts of Long Island at this time? So what we think of as harsh, horrible conditions may have actually benefited human foragers in this region at this time and may have really led to their success. They certainly seem to have taken advantage of the caribou herds. And as the climate became milder, life actually probably became a little bit more challenging as the herd sizes diminished. I'm going to just show one slide, a little site that I excavated that was the focus of my dissertation at Mashantucket. I worked at the Mashantucket Pequot Reservation for an awful long time, and I worked at the museum that I hope most of you have had a chance to see for a long time, supervising archaeology there as well. This was a very tiny little camp. It was, you could have fit it here, the whole site. I was lucky. There's a poor grad student right now. He's taking a site that's 4 times as big as this room, and he's only finding as much as I found in my little tiny site. So he's had it harder. It was a tremendous little site. It dates to the tail end of the Paleo-Indian period. You can see this little spear point here with the sort of parallel flaking on the sides. This is a lancelet leaf-shaped point that really marks the end of this tradition. I know that they're fluting their points to thin them, but the final product looks like this. The site may actually date to as late as 9,150 radiocarbon years ago. Let's call that 10,000, if 500 or 600 years ago in real years. And a lot of my archaeologist friends don't like that. It's too late. They're like, no, it has to be earlier. But I have to base on the objective dates that I've gotten back that I think it may, in fact, date that late in the period. In other words, one of the last vestiges of the Paleo-Indian lifeway in New England. And what we're going to see in this next section is things change very dramatically. The interesting thing is almost all the raw material used at this site comes from the Albany area, the mines at Coxsackie. so-called Norman scale cherts. It's this lovely greenish material. What you see in the picture here are lots of just scraping tools, what I call the unifacial tools. They're only worked on one surface. There's other pictures that show where all the other kinds of tools were located as well, but we don't have to get into it. A great place to spend a couple seasons excavating, and really a wonderful opportunity to learn more about at least the late phase of that Paleo-Indian period. What it looked like to me was that people who were really focused on a northern region and had last been in the Hudson Valley area were coming down into southern New England now and then just to hang out and do some hunting around this wetland. They may have been taking elk or something like that at the time, perhaps some moose or even smaller game, and maybe just staying for a couple weeks during the colder winter season. All right, so we want to also make sure we talk a little about people. We're talking about these vague things about population change and growth, but how did people really live at this time? And we don't know a lot. We have a lot of sites. You've seen a bunch of dots on the map, and we're learning more. It looks like most of the typical sites, at least the ones that archaeologists are able to find, and sites of this period are hard to find, like the little one I talked about, because they're so tiny. When we dig shovel test pits, they're often 50 feet apart, and that's going to jump over 2 of those sites, and you're totally going to miss them during the normal surveys that happen based on the standard sort of procedures that are asked for. So they're easy to miss. They're out there, but we have to remember there were not a whole lot of people living here at the time, so there's also not millions of them. You probably, based on the sites that we do know, you probably spent most of your time in an extended family group. Some of the sites tend to have 2 or 3 clusters of artifacts that suggest sort of tent ring areas. So each one probably a single household. Most sites are not especially dense in material. People may have only lived 2 weeks, 4 weeks in one place before moving on. We know from the stones that they were using that they were acquiring them from 200 or more miles away, that they were walking all over the place to get this stuff. They're probably not trading for it. They're probably getting it firsthand. Late in this period, trade may pick up to a degree, but they're mostly going to these quarries and getting it as part of their annual movement. The beauty of this time with so few people on the landscape is when the geese were molting along the shore of Lake Champlain, you could go up there and with a stick send your kids out there to whack them all on the head and make a pile of geese, 8 feet tall in a couple hours of work because they can't fly. These are things the Eskimos take advantage of. You've got to be taking advantage of that northern flyway to catch them at that moment, right? This is when the foxes and everybody are running out there, so you're competing with them. You can get, walrus are basking on the shores in the thousands, seals, sea lions, all these animals that we don't think about very often in our modern day environment were available to these hunters at certain times of the year. And again, the seals and things, they tend to cluster up in these bunches of thousands only at certain places and at certain times of the year. But you could get yourself there. So life was rich, but you had to move a lot. And they didn't seem to mind moving. You would have had regular meetings with other families. You probably knew, even though people were separated by tens and maybe even hundreds of miles at times, they probably pretty much knew how to find each other. They knew the landscape well, and they could set up times to meet. And when they would meet, there would be a lot of discussion about resources and also all the regular gossip and which daughter is getting old enough to marry. Is my son maybe going to get this chance and things like that. These are the things that matter to people everywhere. Probably at least once a year you would get together in these big groups of people, maybe even 200 people, 40 families like we see at the Bull Brook site, coming together to hunt caribou cooperatively. And that's the time when, socially things are really exciting. People are getting together. People are establishing the mates. The young guys are competing kind of with one another to show off. And that ensured, again, the contact and the communication was happening between a group that was otherwise very dispersed across the environment. So interesting kind of to think about how life ran. I like this picture here because this is our non-traditional. When you think of Paleo-Indians, they always show like 5 guys with giant spears spearing mastodons. And some of that might have happened in the beginning. Probably more and more we realized it was a very diverse diet. As much as they were dependent on caribou for part of the year, they were certainly fishing. They were hunting birds. They were hunting small mammals and things like that too. Certainly the sea mammals that we just don't have a good record of it had to have been taken advantage of. So, life could look like this. Despite the very cold younger Dryas winters, summers were about the same temperature as today. You could go swimming in the lakes. It would have been fine. And that meant you could go fishing and things like this. And netting technologies, while we don't have PaleoIndian nets, it's kind of a no-brainer. Human beings have been making nets for 30 or 50,000 years. So yeah, I'll say they had nets. Okay, I said I'd spend more time on these first couple. Someone's going to keep track for me. I don't know. All right, the end of the Ice Age. Things traditionally in New England and the greater Northeast were considered bleak. It was believed the forests were all pine trees. The biggest animal to hunt was a red squirrel, which are the little squirrels, not even the gray squirrels, right? And it was likely no one even lived here for like 2,000 years. This is based on ideas that these two archaeologists, Ritchie and Fitting, had. One was in the Great Lakes, and Ritchie was really the grandfather of northeastern archaeology in New York State. And at the time, it fit the data. They just had very little evidence that people were even around after the Paleo-Indians had kind of left the region and probably shifted their way of life further north as the glaciers receded. However, recent finds at Mashantucket suggest that model, that sort of real bleak interpretation of what we call the early Holocene forests, that early post-glacial forest, is just not a very good one. So here's the kind of foggy, scary spruce forest. But if you look carefully, there's some cattail growing in the front. And it's things like that that turn out to have made the difference. All right, the Sandy Hill site was located, you can see the Mashantucket Pequot Casino, Foxwoods Casino in the background there, as part of a big parking lot expansion. We had the chance to kind of go in and test areas very close to the casino where artifacts had been identified in prior years. And the amazing thing was that we found this area on a slope. And most archaeologists, they kind of dismiss slopes as kind of crummy places to set up a house, right? You can't build a house on a hill, usually. But there were thousands and thousands of little chips of quartz coming out of the ground. And as some of this area started getting stripped away by machines, there were these dense black horizons that were showing up in the ground, these big sort of circular areas that were like, what's that? It was so big, we could not figure it out. As we stopped all the equipment and sort of started getting there and doing the excavations, we realized that these black soil horizons were full of like burnt hazelnut shell, and the quartz was just glistening out of them. And we found dozens and dozens of these funny little balls of quartz that have been struck around the edges, and I think they're all just little tiny cores for knocking off little quartz flakes. And there were just thousands. Now, this is the thing I got to say. At Mashantucket in the basement, this site's been worked on it was worked on and off for over a decade. The artifacts from this site now take up more space in the collections area from any of the archaeological sites on the Pequot Reservation. And this site, it turns out, is 10,000 years old. There's a wall that goes from, say, here to, like, I don't know, the little blue funny symbol there. It's at least that wide, with shells going as high as the walls here, like 7 banks of shells that pull out in drawers, and the whole thing is full of the quartz artifacts from this site, and these weird big chopping stones and big rocks. It's on the sandy area. Anything bigger than a pebble was brought into the site, we know, just because of the geology of the site. So we really got serious about this, and you can see the kind of trenching that was going on. This is all, everything's being dug very carefully by hand with shovels and trowels and screened, so we didn't have machines cut into it at this point. There's Dan Forrest and I. Dan Forrest is in the yellow hat. He's the current State Historic Preservation Officer in Hartford. And there's me in the blue hat, working away back in, this is about 1997, I guess. I'm very pleased to see that, that I had the opportunity to become the state archaeologist, and I see Dan in the SHPO's office now, and it makes me feel sort of good about the worlds. But this is where we were starting. I was a grad student at the time. Dan was an undergrad at UConn. But what you can see in the wall here that's been exposed is these big black soil stains, okay? And this is what we had to decode. What the heck is going on here? Archaeologists find what they call features in the ground. Now, that's usually a small black stain, and it's usually, a round thing like this, and it goes down about this deep, and it'll have a couple of artifacts associated, and maybe some charcoal. And it's usually the remnants of a little fire hearth cooking area that someone had made. But seldom had we ever seen something that just extended off, like the scale. So generally, I'm going to do this. these things were showing up in the wall like a basin, like a bathtub. It'd be black soils like this. They'd come down, and then they'd rise again, about that wide. And you can kind of see some of that here. But what we got are multiple levels. So there's one level going here, and then there's another layer on top of it here. And actually, then there'd be another layer as you went up the hill more and more. And eventually, we kind of figured out that these are all the bottoms of houses. And all that charcoal that had built up over months and months of living inside these places, the burnt hazelnut shells scattered all over the floor. Eventually, we started finding things like post molds and some better-looking hearths. But a lot of it was just sort of trampled charcoal, again, very soft, sandy soils. Everything was kind of homogenized into it, but thousands and thousands of little pieces of quartz at the same time. The very first radiocarbon dates from the site came back at about 10,000 years ago, roughly 9,000 radiocarbon years ago. So we had this massive, massive site full of artifacts and full of giant houses, basically pretty big houses. I mean, they're not as big as our houses, but this is, 12 feet across, 4 meters or so across, enough to put a big family into and overwinter. Dug into the side of the hill. It became increasingly clear these are being dug out into the sand and then covered with probably some kind of logs and roofing material that hadn't survived. All this was happening at a time when no one was supposed to even live in New England. This is practically a village site. So we were just flabbergasted, and we wanted to kind of try to understand how the heck you could sustain a population when the biggest animal was supposed to be a squirrel, right? This is just another view of later excavation in 2002. We actually had a chance, instead of trenching, we finally looked at it straight down, and you can kind of see, you see the black stain. It makes an oval here, and it extends under the existing road. The rest is still under that roadway. And this went down another, couple feet into the ground, and you can imagine it kind of just scooping in, and there were big post molds. That means stains where the structural supports had been placed in the ground deepened, and there was a hearth in this end and another one kind of at that end. There were concentrations of burnt bone at one end and concentrations of burnt plant material in another area. So everything kind of really fell into place. It was just remarkable. You don't find stuff like this even from 100 years ago, from 400 years ago. In 2006, they went back because construction was continuing near other parts of the site, and they found additional house floors up to the eastern area. And one of the more intriguing features was this, which it's kind of hard to see, but this drops down in the wall, kind of comes out around, and then rises again where the stake is. And you can see the smudgy kind of charcoal stains that are still near the bottom of that, what had been a pit, dug down beneath one of the house floors, and then very carefully stacked on top of that pit. Seemed very, very purposeful. It could not have been accidental that they were all right over this pit. With these big tools that we call just choppers, because we don't know what else to call them. They've been found in the archaeological record. They're described from other sites. And one of these was examined a couple years ago by a guy at Yukon who was looking for starch grain residues, and he did find something called yellow nutsedge. It was like a single fragment, so it's just a bare hint. But the nutsedge is a plant that grows in kind of meadowy areas, not really swamp and not dry areas, but sort of that meadowy kind of wet ground. And it produces little tiny rootlets, little balls about this big. But if you collect hundreds and hundreds of them, they're a good source of food. And it turns out that these hoes were probably being used, at least in part, to harvest those plants. And some of the other stuff we're getting then is cattail and a number of other wetland species that could well have also been harvested with these hoe-like implements. So on the top left, you've got water plantain. Most of you guys have probably seen these growing around the edges of the swamps. In the lower left, you've got cattail. Now, cattail root, it turns out, is one of the best producers of starch of any plant on the planet. Back in the 50s, there was articles being written by guys at I think Cornell who wanted to start harvesting and growing giant cattail plantations to get the starch so they can convert it. Even back then, they're thinking about things like biofuels, or there was a lot of use for starch potentially to produce alcohol industrially. Hazelnut is in the top. I think this is sort of the modern version, but the hazelnuts back then were a little smaller. Arrowhead is the bottom center. Cypress esculentus, or the yellow nutsedge, is up on the top right there. And then water lily. And then there's bulrush and a number of other plants. Now these plant species were identified by scanning electron microscopy by a guy who specialized in looking at burnt plant tuber remains. And some of this is a little bit speculative still, but boy, he claims to have identified a lot of these plants, and there was something like 30 species overall. But things like cattail especially were very abundant, and the hazelnut shells. And it turns out a lot of these species really grow best where humans start getting in there and mucking around a lot. If you start pulling cattail roots out the next year, they grow back in even greater abundance because you've broken up the rhizomes. And with hazelnut, if you cut it and coppice it, it sprouts up even more thickly. So what we get is a suggestion that humans are actually starting to manipulate and utilize the natural environment in a way that's promoting the growth of certain specific species that are beneficial to them. There's a real sense that they're manipulating the environment in a very kind of hands-on way. It's not agriculture, but they're doing something to really alter things out there, and we found that very exciting. So one of the mysteries is, what the heck are all these quartz flakes about? And to be fair, this is still an open question. We haven't resolved it yet. But when I was heading back from one of the Society of Archaeology meetings in Colorado, I think it was, say, 2002 or so, I was reading through one of the books that you get. People are handing out all their stuff. It was like a little magazine someone had given me, and I'm reading a little article, and it's talking about manioc graters from South America. And it's like, there's a plank of wood, and there's these diagrams, they make these cool pictures on them. And then I read the next line, and each grater contains like 10,000 chips of quartz. And I said, what? So it turns out that this grater technology is very traditional. You find it all around the planet. It's one that most of us have kind of forgotten about. And it's been supplanted by the use of sort of metal grating tools. You just need a sheet of tin, and you can kind of pound holes in it, and it turns into a grater. So in areas where these traditional grater boards were used, they're just not used anymore. My hypothesis, and it has yet to be tested with things like a starch residue analysis, it could be done, is that some kind of tool that might have looked like this was being used by the people at Sandy Hill to process all those wetland tubers to produce starch. You just have to kind of rinse it off, soak it, dry it out. You could literally hang it in bags. You start talking about starch, they could even be making fermented beverages. We don't know. But we'll hold that one for later. I think, though, they are really collecting masses and masses of starch to have as a food resource over the winter, and that's what kept these societies going. The site was reused for 500 years, revisited by at least individual big families and maybe even numbers of families at the same time. It's a little bit hard to resolve that detail. All right, we don't want to get into too much of this, but there were people here 10,000 years ago after the Ice Age. After all, they were not making big spear points like we saw before. There's none of these arrowheads at the site. No spear points. They didn't have bow and arrow yet anyway. They would have just had spears. They're not doing that. They're trapping maybe, but they seem to be really focused on these wetland plants. These are big sites. They're long-term encampments, and they're reused for an extended period of time. People are probably manipulating and altering the environments around them. And so we see social organization, sort of a complex way of community life that we had not ever expected existed. Certainly not at this time. It is, in fact, the Sandy Hill site remains the biggest site on the Pequot Reservation until the Pequot Fort is built in the 1670s in response to King Philip's War. I mean, that's sort of the perspective there. It is just a massive site. Okay, we're going to kind of crank through a little bit so I don't take too much of your day. But traditional exchange systems are those gifts between individuals. What I want to focus on is that all gifts, they're never free, right? This is what they say, gifts are never free. Traditionally, gifting is it's a form of insurance. When I give to you, I can assume in the future you're probably going to give back to me. And this is a way hunter-gatherers, especially in traditional societies, would really survive hard times. Is during the good times, you give to your neighbors, and when things go bad for you, you can kind of expect the returns. It is this sort of gifting back and forth we still see among ourselves and our own societies, and it really is part of what defines us as human beings. It's a very social mechanism for creating indebtedness. We don't like to think of our holidays that way, but they really do. They create indebtedness. All right, what I refer to as formal exchange systems, I think of as more things that happen between communities. They're not at the individual level. I think you'd expect them to find them occurring redundantly at special events like big times of burial for the dead. People died during the winter. You could not bury them. You'd hold them over, and in the spring or summer when the ground was soft, you could kind of get them back in the ground. There were these, traditionally in societies in Northeast, there were these events called the Feasts of the Dead, and people would get together from a number of communities to bury their dead. At events like that, you get specific kinds of tools being made to be given away. And in the case of the burial ceremony, those we see about 3,500 years ago, they are specific offerings for the dead, it looks like. So there's some kind of honoring of the dead. At the same time, this is an opportunity for certain, probably families or maybe whole groups, to kind of show off their social wealth. And it's social wealth because what you get in exchange is showing how well connected you are. The more stuff you can put in your ancestor's grave, it is good for the dead person, we assume, but boy, it's saying something about you, mostly, in the living world. We want to think about how people interpreted this from the living side, too. And I believe we're seeing the development of competition in the sort of gift-giving ceremonies associated with burials around this time, which is hinting at the development of more complex social and economic inequalities, or setting the stage for these inequalities to develop. I like to see this right now as between communities at this time, what we call the terminal archaic period, and it shifts in the next 1,000 years to competition between certain individuals that get buried with all the good stuff. Okay? Why do you bother going to these sort of formal exchange systems? Most of the archaeology across North America suggests that by 5,000 years ago, things were getting tough. There's a lot of people in the environment. A lot of the places, now Connecticut's not among them where we have good preservation of human skeletal remains, but where you find it, in upstate New York or in Illinois, a lot of those burials have severe trauma associated with them. There might be arrow wounds, or spear wounds, I should say, because again, bow and arrow hadn't really developed yet. And most of it's like head trauma from being hit with some kind of big, heavy object. So your strategy to prevent constant warfare is probably to set up these formal trade systems and relationships and set up alliances and allegiances with your neighbors to keep things kind of, as long as everyone's connected and related to one another, it's much less likely that you're going to start fighting one another. So these are strategies, I think. The development of these complex trade networks are probably strategies to curtail violence. They do provide these opportunities again for, as we get into the competitive trading and things, that individuals can start promoting themselves or aggrandizing themselves in their own communities and setting themselves up as what we call sometimes big men. Around the same time those formal exchange mechanisms start to develop, we see some changes in technology. First, you get the soapstone bowls. You've got that on the upper left. Around 3,500 years ago, 3,400 years ago, these are showing up. Eventually, they show up in a lot of the burials as well as gifted objects. And by 3,000 or so years ago, you get pottery, ceramic technologies being used. Now, again, these are, I think we tend to think of changes like this as invention. I think that's kind of a bad way to see it, because people always could do these things, in my view, but at some point you choose to do them and it becomes part of your way of life. And I think the choosing to do it, because it's a lot of work even to make a clay pot, and they break a lot, and you got to make them again. And if you're going to make one of those soapstone bowls, that's hundreds of hours of work. You got to go to a quarry where you find the stuff. We have it in Connecticut, up in Barkhamsted region. There's a number of soapstone quarries. You have to chip it all out, and you've got to remove the big block, and then you've got to hollow the whole thing out. I mean, it's hundreds and hundreds of hours of work. So you have to ask yourself, why are they doing this? And I think one of the answers is changes in foodways. Traditionally, in the Archaic period, say between 8,000 and 3,000 years ago, you had all the deer and beaver and turkey that you wanted. These animals reproduce pretty quickly, and they're plentiful. At some point, probably after about 3,000, 3,500 years ago, these items are probably getting hunted out increasingly. Or people that have good herds of deer in their forests are kind of starting to protect them more. And we shift to foods, smaller and smaller food items like chenopodium or lamb's foot also known as quinoa in South America on the right, and things like shellfish on the lower right. Now, do you guys know how many eaten quinoa? Oh, look at that. That's a good, healthy part of the state. But this is, it's like a superfood, right? But it's like bird seed. This is like, and the other thing is you can't just eat it raw. You've got to do all this stuff. Now, when you buy it in the supermarket, it's been processed for you. You probably don't know that. You have to parch it, and you have to, sometimes they do sort of acid or base washes and things like this. But generally, the approach is to parch it. And so something like a soapstone bowl or a platter is probably a device used to parch the quinoa. And this stuff grows into sort of disturbed environments really well. It grows all over the place. People have been using it for 30,000 or more years. It's not like a new invention, but something picks up at this time. And I think these big soapstone bowl platters are part of that. The ceramics, maybe. The quinopodium connection there is a little weaker. But hickory nuts, for example, you boil into a pot and you produce this lovely hickory milk, things like that. And the shellfish, too, become an increasing part of the diet. Shellfish probably were kind of ignored now and then. I mean, you'd use them seasonally, but we see that for the first time after about 3,000 years ago, shellfish exploitation really explodes, and you get the big shell mounds and things developing all around the coastal areas. Okay, so how are these things affecting the community? People who are living in forests that are fairly densely populated can't move around as much as they used to. People are more increasingly protective of their resources. It's possible that group identities start forming around this time, say 3,000 years ago, where you say, we are the people of the X, the branch in the stream here, or the shallow waters, as the Pequot name suggests. We are the people of the shallow waters. You've got to get more food from less land. And you're just going to start to adopt these new technologies, and you're going to spend hundreds of hours making the things that allow you to get food out of the land, because you basically don't have a lot of choice anymore. Living in bigger groups increases your level of social stress. You get 200 or 300 people living in a community, you need some leadership. Whether you're thinking about a big, I think about my undergrad classrooms, all right? So I forget how many people showed up today, but this is a pretty big room, and if we all had to decide what would be the best way to build a snowman, there'd be a lot of argumentation until someone stepped up and said, okay, you guys build the bottom part and you're going to do the middle, all right? So it takes coordination when you get more than a family-sized group together, and you start to get centralized leadership. So this kind of brings us to the question of what are complex societies. Now, this is the Cahokia site out in Illinois that I mentioned. Again, an urban center a lot of Americans don't even know existed. It is very much modeled on things we're seeing in Central America around the same time, among the Toltecs who would have been around at this time. Big plazas, ritual games, big, I don't even think that shows up here, but there's, big kind of henge monuments that mark the calendrical changes. They had this game called Chunky where they would roll a round stone and throw spears, competitive games, and a lot of betting going on apparently. And you had a real elite class. And not only this, there are ceremonial burials under some of these mounds where 50 women were killed and laid in the ground like cordwood. People were decapitated. They'd have their hands cut off and put in these elite burials. There's some interesting stuff happening, all right? Like, to get away with that, you've got to be a pretty big honcho to I'm going to kill 50 people. You don't normally in society get to do that, right? You have to be a scary guy. And that means you got to be connected to the gods and things. And we know from the way they were, the chieftains were the only ones allowed to wear copper. It was too powerful. It would burn you up, like something from an Indiana Jones movie. But these guys could wear copper because they were associated with the gods. In New York, among the Iroquois societies, we get big villages, big palisaded villages. Warfare had been going on, an incessant part of life from 1200 AD. And by the time 1500 or so, when the first Europeans started exploring this area, they'd actually developed very complex political strategies to lessen war, creating these central councils of 50 high chiefs who would get together and make important decisions, and developing kind of war chief systems. And women, by the way, too, were the head of the clans, And basically, behind all those 50 guys at the council were the clan women who were pretty much probably telling them what to do. It was a very female-focused society, actually. Each of the longhouses would have held one of the clans. And we think of Algonquin way of life here in New England, focused on the wigwam, the small shelter usually. We didn't get the longhouses so often. They probably occurred a little bit, but they were smaller. We tend to think of small family units. We don't think of giant palisaded villages. And we have to ask ourselves, so were these guys just simpler? Were they less evolved in some ways socially? What's going on? And I want to promote the idea that I don't think they were. I think they were making choices. And again, these are these sort of anthropological questions we want to start asking about the way societies change. Is there always a shift in a linear way from simplicity to complexity in political and social life? Probably not. I think what's happening is that Algonquins are making a choice. They know full well what the Iroquois are doing nearby. They're fighting with those guys all the time. They know how they live. They see the advantage of that central society and the big palisade walls. They seem to be opting out. And there's part of that seems to be that they are very distrustful of central leadership at that high level. In a way, it reminds me, if anyone studied European prehistory, the way the Celts behaved. There were no kingdoms among the Celts, really. These were small chieftain societies. They valued their independence highly. In fact, just a quick divergence to some of the early kind of Roman history of the period, Vercingetorix was one of the chiefs who was able to fight and rise up and bring the bands together against the Romans, and he failed miserably at the Battle of Alesia. His father before him had attempted to do this, though. He had been killed by his own people, stabbed, because he was acting too big for his britches. And in a way, I wonder if these Algonquin sachems, with their sort of limited range of authority, we're living in a sort of cultural value system that also said, we don't want too much central leadership. That can go to bad places. We see at Cahokia, people being lined up and killed or tortured. They knew about that stuff too. They say, wait, no, we don't want to live like that. We like this sort of smaller scale life. We like the independence of being able to move from place to place more often and not being stuck in a big, cramped, noisy village with all the dogs barking and everything else. So sachems are an interesting class of leaders in Algonquin society. They're very high status people. That status is passed on to their children. They tended to marry among other high-ranking people from other tribes. A sachem was allowed to have multiple wives, and most men didn't. And that's always a sign of kind of high rank. But when it came to decision-making, all the accounts seem to suggest that the sachem's power was quite limited. If all the other decision-making people, whether men or women in that group, did not agree, then something wouldn't happen. Like a lot of so-called big men in these, what anthropologists call big man societies, he had to lead by example, largely. The sachems tended to be excellent fighters. They were known for their prowess in battle. They probably had spiritual powers as well. And again, anthropologically around the world, we see these as common traits given to men of high rank. But even if you're born into a high family, it didn't guarantee that you were going to be a leader. People like Uncas of the Mohegans were interesting examples. When he was buried, I think he had 7 wives. And when he was buried, he had a large number of big brass kettles that were then given out to his sons. He had 6 or something rifles, flintlocks, that were also kind of passed on to different people. He had acquired quite a wealth. And all those items are symbolic. I'm sure the guns came as gifts from various tribes. The pots represented his ability to hold big feasts and bring people together. So they were powerful, well-respected leaders. And yet, there was this level of balance that had happened that said they couldn't make unanimous decisions or just decisions on their own. That it was always balanced by the community that they lived in. So it's an interesting thing to understand. What I suspect is something bad had happened here, where some leaders had gotten too powerful, and this is a response. We see this around the world, different places, where you get this, and frankly, that Mississippian society at Cahokia, it falls apart Shortly after that time, where all these guys are beheaded and put in graves and stuff, that whole system collapses. People spread out again. And they start rebuilding similar groups elsewhere with their temples and things. But it's a very fragile sort of way of life. And people are able to rebel and walk if they want to. You're not yet into a point where we have like today's modern state society that really controls everything from the top down. So there were options for people. And I think this, the sacredom of this region, it speaks to maybe a time when people got a little bit too big for their britches and people said, no, we are going to keep things better in check. So native life in Connecticut, just to sort of end, small-scale societies, but living close to the land, even when maize and beans and squash enter into the region 1,000 years ago, and beans were the last part, 1300 AD they get here. That's when you see the first real villages come. Until you get beans, the villages don't really develop. So at the heart of the way of life was still gathering food. Much of the food gathered, despite starting to plant gardens, was coming from the wild. These are pictures from Ashantucket, Pequot, too, if you don't recognize them. This is a man showing his son how to fletch his arrows. And again, it's a passing on of these cultural traditions. That's sort of the main message here at the museum. And then our daily life, again, focused on the family and keeping things very close to home, I think, as a value in this society. And the freedom to move from place to place when one wanted. Okay. So just to summarize again, that's it. But Connecticut, to me, is a marvelous, and New England more broadly, is a marvelous laboratory for understanding these changes in human society that have been going on for 13,000 years. These are issues that our anthropologists look at all around the planet. They're equally as valid to look at where we are. And I think, frankly, we've got some really fascinating things to examine. Why do the sachems, why were they sort of afforded only limited power? What's the difference between them and the Iroquois? What's going on there? And why do we not develop big chiefdom level societies like we see at Cahokia with mounds and platforms and mass executions of people? What's the difference? How much of that has to do with human choice and how much is sort of this sort of misguided sense of linear projection of technology and social life and complexity? So again, I think we come back to human choice often. And that's it, I think. So if maybe people have a couple questions, I try not to take too much of your time. I see I probably went over a bit. But thanks for your patience. Okay. So at this point, should we give people who want to run away a chance, and then those who want to stay can do some questioning? Yeah, actually, in the blue.
What was the temperature after the Ice Age?
After the Ice Age?
They don't look very well dressed there.
Which, for some, the people fishing, for example, that was the one in the...
I didn't see a lot of clothing, and I would not imagine that it was warm.
During the Ice Age, you would have worn caribou parkas and really with sewn very carefully with bone needle, really tailored clothing, really high-tech tailored clothing was the key to survival in the Paleo-Indian period. We don't have the needles here, again, because preservation is bad for small bone implements, but out west they find these from this period. And they're identical to the ones you would find in Europe at the same time. But later on, people get pretty used to it. Like after the Ice Age, the winters were tough. 8,000 years ago, actually, there was a period where it got warmer than it is today. There was a warming that happened. So it's hard to kind of know. But we don't tend to run around in the winter, we're pretty bundled up, but we're also not living in a wigwam or a small shelter where we get very acclimated. People who live in teepees and stuff for fun, like students who decide they're going to do that for a semester, they start running around outside in their t-shirts after about a month. They get really used to it. We're pretty capable. If you're getting enough fat and starch and stuff into your body, the stuff we're not supposed to eat in modern day, you do all right. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I'm just curious on, digging for artifacts. Being a gardener, you keep hitting rock.
Yeah.
How can you get any artifacts? It's like the glacier, and every time you dig next year, it seems like there are more rocks.
Oh, there's always more. They call them New England potatoes. They came out more and more every year for the farmers of New England. We live in a very stony environment because of the Ice Age. The glaciers bulldozed the landscape and deposited very rocky soils all over the areas. The only places that are sandy and nice were associated with sort of glacial lake zones where water eroded down and settled into the edges of lakes and things. So those are the sandy spots, and they're few. Most of it is what we call till. It's upland till. It's stony soil. The tough part is, unlike a lot of the world where you might have deep, deep horizons, even within the sort of just natural outdoor areas, where the ancient stuff is down here and then the more recent stuff is near the top, everything in New England is compressed into that first foot or so of soil. Unless you're in a river floodplain or some weird place where just a lot of erosion happened to bury things deeply. So at the Pequot Fort, for example, digging there, I found a 10,000-year-old spear point above 300-year-old artifacts associated with the fort. Things have been turned around a lot by all the rodents. We don't think about all the little moles and all these guys. This is a time depth thing. So one mole creates a path, and you see what it does in your yard, right? It's moving stuff around. Sometimes they go deep. The toads even, they go down deep in the winter to hide. You add that up for 10,000 years. And then the trees. The studies that have been done is that every 6,000 or so years, every square inch of forest has been turned over by tree throws. What does that do to the archaeological record? Everything's been a little bit blurred, so when we find pretty clean sites, we're awfully happy. But they're the exception. Now, a little blurring is okay. We can deal with these natural processes, because a lot of the stuff is more or less, kind of where it belongs. And we're looking at things at a human scale, and if people were cooking over there and maybe making their stone tools here, and hopefully even a few tree throws hasn't destroyed that patterning entirely. But those are the kind of simple questions we're trying to answer when we excavate. Yeah?
Oh, and of course I have two questions.
Uh-huh.
But one is, what is your theory about, maybe more peaceful Indians being in the Chesapeake Bay or in this area as opposed to the, stone structures? Is life easier here? All that. And the second one, compared to the Iroquois. And the second question is, so why did each sort of areas develop their characteristic spearheads? Why is that so definitive for you guys? Is it that kind of rock, some master little spearhead maker figured out the best way and everyone copied them, or was it the only way to get, or is it the size of the animal? And when I grew up in Long Island, right across on the North Shore, and in the 50s, we found arrowheads for sure on the beach.
Yeah.
And they are, because we checked out that they were, little.
Yep.
Maybe for opening shelf. I don't know, but they were all around.
Yeah.
Because it was in the sand, it was rain.
Well, yeah, you only need to go back like 1,000 years, and water table is still a little bit lower, and those areas are getting kind of constantly churned up by the waves and storms now and brought up onto the beaches. There's a lot of artifacts from the last 3,000 or so years that show up in the beach areas. They're getting churned up and redeposited. They're all worn and things. As you get deeper out, some of those are a little bit better preserved in berries. All right, so go back to your first question now, and then we'll do the second one, actually. How peaceful was life here? I'm not sure it was. I know anthropologists, archaeologists that I work with who say, Algonquins, they were nice to each other and everything. But the burials that we have that are recorded from like shell middens where they're better preserved, there's like a guy from Niantic, he had 40 bone points in him. And in other words, and that's not just killing someone, that's like a ritual killing. That's something funny is going on. And again, I think when we find human remains, they're very, very often associated with projectile points. And, the sad thing is, even I should advertise this, we had to reschedule the Kennewick Man talk. Doug Owsley, very important anthropologist from Smithsonian, is going to be talking about that, hopefully up at Farmington on the 21st. That's not really 22nd maybe now. It was rescheduled. That was another meeting that we had coming up. But that guy who dates to 9,300 radiocarbon years ago, we'll call that 10,500 real years ago, he had like a spear point in his pelvis, and he had damage to his skull from being beaten on a few times. It's like no one lived here then. Why did they have to hit each other? But sadly, I've come to the point, looking at this history of human primates, we are like all other big primates. We're kind of mean. Right? The stuff with the chimpanzees that happens, and the primate behavior is complex, and often it can get very violent. And there's plenty to fight over. Yeah. All right, so projector point. So I'm a little bit of a pessimist on human nature, and culture's a good thing because it keeps us from killing each other constantly, right? Society's a good thing. Police are probably a good. Anyway, Projected point, we call it typology. It's the study of how points change and vary over time and space. Both things are variables. But through time, there are wonderful examples around the world of how, like, a spear point will shift. It's, you know, the base gets a little shorter and it gets a little broader. It changed, like every couple hundred years there's notable change. And I think basically the answer is this is just a human thing. It has to do with style. It doesn't have to do with function or improvements, hardly ever. It's the way changes in the automobile happened. I mean, some of that's technological progression over time, right? There's a little mix of both. But these tend to be stylistic things. Like the differences between all the modern cars in the market today are null, practically. I mean, you can spend a lot of money on a really fancy one. But it's really about, what am I trying to say with my vehicle? Am I trying to say I'm a really nice, I'm a kind of ecologically minded person, and I'm driving this Prius, or I'm, you know, whether or not those are ecologically, I have one, so anyway, disposing of batteries is that issue, right? Or do I drive a giant, you know, Hummer that gets 8 miles to the gallon to show how wealthy I am because I can afford the gas, you know, and things like these we're saying things with our vehicles, and the cars are made to help us express something about ourselves. And in the past, it was they would change through time. Like the cars of the 50s just don't look like the cars of today anymore. It's mostly style, though. It's not, even then, it's not really all technology. We could still be making monstrous cars like the 50s, but we don't. If we made them out of carbon fiber, they'd be light and get good mileage, but it's just not what you drive anymore. So think, you know, earrings change, sneakers change, everything changes. You know, trains changed. Everything, you know, it's that pattern of constant stylistic change that we go through. Whether we're getting bored or whatever, we learn from our father. The other thing is, what the anthropologists have sort of studied is, there's basically something like a 3% standard error rate when one person copies and learns from another person. So every generation, there's like a 3% difference. And that, after 200 years, that adds up to a different thing. We give it a new name, right? That's what it comes down to, yeah. Yeah, we'll go way in the back.
You're talking about carbon dating years versus time.
Yeah.
What causes the difference?
It gets tricky, but it's basically, the radiocarbon dates are based on, ultimately it's carbon dioxide that's being absorbed into the body. So it's atmospheric carbon that the body is absorbing. We're all breathing it in now. And it's getting into our bones. It's helping us build our bodies. The carbon dioxide we breathe is dependent at all times on, let's start back. Radiocarbon represents a very small proportion of the carbon atoms that are floating around in the atmosphere that are attached to those two oxygen molecules that form CO2. So some small portion of them are these radioactive, unstable carbon isotopes. Over time, the proportion of those unstable carbon isotopes has changed, and the proportion of those in the atmosphere has shifted. Sometimes it's solar flares. It seems to have to do something with uptake from the surface of the ocean a lot. So during lower water tables in the ice age, it's a little different than when the ocean levels are higher. It has to do with the temperatures on the Earth. The way you form, though, the radioactive carbon in the atmosphere is usually solar energy smacking into a nitrogen atom that it removes, I think, a proton or something and turns it into this unstable carbon form. It goes from N14 to C12, well, C13. C14, N14 to C14. So it's loss of I think it's a proton or a neutron, I forget what it is. But so it has to do with the atmospheric proportions of unstable carbon. And it changes over time. It just fluctuates. So the radiocarbon dates are based on a constant assumption of decay life of 5,700 or so years. It's just not always quite that even. So they have ways of adjusting that to get it back to the real clock. Yeah, and we'll come next.
I'm rather fascinated by what you kept mentioning, the housing
Mm-hmm.
at time. And, my question to you is, the roof made up, what's they use for materials for these houses? And the other question is, when you said massive, what's massive?
Massive is probably pretty small by today's standard. But for the Sandy Hill site, they're big. They're like, say, 12, 15-foot diameter houses. They're dug into the hillside. So first there's a lot of labor. You got to move it's sand, so it moved easily. But they had the hose, they had these other digging implements probably to help move sand around. They would scoop out the back wall of the hill and pull it forward. And in doing so, they often then buried the earlier floor that was just a little bit downslope to make a nice fresh floor. What we're seeing around the edges is like kind of a depression, as if it was dug out, scooped out around the edges, and that's probably where big split beams were placed in to make walls. And this is kind of guesswork, but based on kind of what we're seeing, there's a couple posts usually in the middle to help support some kind of roof, and they were probably, I think, planking out like oak. There was a massive stone tool from that site this big, and the only thing it's good for is be like planking oak. If certain oaks you can like form nice big, because they didn't have saws to make timber like wood like we do, but you can plank a lot of woods out because they shear off in sheets kind of. And so you could make, even if you had to just split the logs or whatever, you could still make a big roof. So it's a big kind of timber framed structure built into the hillside in that case, probably. And maybe even had a kind of sod roof. And that's sort of similar to stuff we see in the northwest regions of the U.S. The Modoc people were building these kind of semi-subterranean lodges. They call it a lodge, probably. Now later in time, the wigwam is the normal house that we think of for the Algonquin peoples of this region. And no doubt that was usually the case. But I've dug on sites that are about 5,000 or 4,000 years old that also seem to have kind of earth lodges. So I think for winter, that's your ideal kind of house. The wigwam is probably pretty drafty. And even the winter wigwams are probably dug into the ground a bit. So, here, wait, I'll see you, yes?
I was wondering about that early post-glacial period when there were groups of maybe 250 wandering around, and when they met each other. Do we know anything about how they communicated with each other? Was there a single language? And then furthermore, was it that groups of 250 wandering around who then diverged and became the Algonquin to the east and the Iroquois to the west? Or was there another influx of people from the west that became the Iroquois?
See, and those histories and ties to modern people get really complicated. But to go back to language, that's an interesting question. The Algonquin language family, which covers like parts of central Canada all the way out to Nova Scotia and then down to the Chesapeake, it's a big, big language group. And it's subdivided in smaller pieces. The original group, I think, as a whole, the linguists can kind of trace everything back using glottochronology and the kind of special tools they have to guesstimate when the kind of original language existed before the divisions happened. And it's about 5,000 years ago by some people calculate that a little bit later. Now within that, then there's subdivisions. And even like the Pequot language is different from Narragansett, is different from Micmac. And these things all divide, and the guesses there are more like in the 1,000-year range between these groups. Iroquois is a whole other thing. That's associated with a language group that was forming down in the southeast, like where the Cherokee are, we associate now. They seem to have kind of moved up. They might have been in Pennsylvania. They moved into this region that might have been sort of an Algonquin homeland and kind of started spreading out. And they guess and argue about this. And maybe it was 2,000 years ago, maybe it was 1,200 years ago, somewhere in there. The formation of this sort of Iroquois spread.
So an unrelated language.
Yeah, so what's interesting is the questions about like in the PaleoIndian period, when do we get so first there's a dialect form, and then eventually they could become so different, they're really a different language. So I would guess when you start to see projectile point differences between regions, you've probably got a dialect difference. Because people are not in constant communication anymore with each other. So the way they express themselves and their emphasis and things like that on certain vowel sounds is going to start to shift over time. And, so yeah, we see that as early as, the PaleoIndian period, probably. But it's challenging because then we get these incursions over time. We see the Sandy Hill folks developing their own weird way of life 10,000 years ago. That probably becomes a very distinctive thing. That way of life seems to shift up into central Maine, and it's probably eventually associated with the red paint people, if anyone's familiar with that group. That's like 6,000 years ago. Boy, but there's incursions of people like 3,500 years ago that then sort of swamp a lot of that out, or they appear to. Now, are those migrations? Is it cultural change? This is where it gets challenging. But it's been a very dynamic cultural and linguistic landscape. I guess that would be my answer. And it's challenging to know what the modern people's relationship to those ancient languages always was.
Thank you.
What is the earliest writing and pictures that we've found in Connecticut?
Connecticut does not have a lot of like stone, like the pictographs and things. You get those in Maine, Vermont more. There are some.
I think the ones that we have, which again, to call it writing, there's some kind of symbols pecked into stone, and they occur now and then. They're rare in Connecticut. They're not well dated. They're hard to date those kinds of things. I think the assumption is they tend to be from the last 2,000 or so years. And real writing systems, it's another way we judge cultures, you know, is it complicated or not? But there was no need to really keep track of stuff that way, as they might have had in Mesopotamia 6,000 years ago, right? It's all about, that's about trade and keeping track of tallies and taxes, and so until you leave that, even the Mississippian societies never developed a writing system, even though they're very complex. However, then you got the Cherokee that decide to kind of on their own, and it's hard to know what the roots of that were, but they developed their own alphabet to write in the Cherokee language. There's stuff written in bark in places in Michigan too that's complicated and weird, and it predates. It seems to be around this time of European contact, but it probably has more ancient roots. So there was ways of writing things in bark that they kept. You know, these are like these little people getting into the beginnings of writing everywhere. But we don't know much, you know, and generally it wasn't, if you didn't need it, you didn't do it. Storytelling was the main way of passing information, traditionally in every society. Yeah.
What's the life expectancy for Indians back in that time? Native Americans?
That's a good question. I don't think, to be fair, we don't have enough good skeletal information in Connecticut. In general, the skeletons say that are preserved from Illinois, New York. I think what I'd have to go is, a lot of those guys are in their mid-40s in the graves. You know, they're living good full lives if they make it that far. Most traditional societies, the death rate for youth is about 50% before the age of 15, though. So a lot of kids die. That's very common. Life is tough. There's disease. There's other issues. There are episodes of hunger, and that hits the young people first, and the elderly. And often you hear the stories about the elderly choosing to like not eat and let the mothers get enough food to take care of the babies or whatever. So it was a tough life, and I think it was often a violent life for men. That varied probably century to century. So you might have been, if you were lucky enough to live in a time of peace, you lived to be a happy 50-plus-year-old person. Certainly individuals lived into their 70s now and then. There's no reason it didn't happen, but partly a matter of chance. And life could be risky. So average probably was something like 45, because that's about the average of most traditional societies. Yep.
I'm fascinated by the Connecticut Department of Archaeology. Can you talk a little bit about what percent of your time is spent on regulations versus finding sites versus education versus raising money versus whatever else you do?
Raising money would be a good one. Yeah, okay, so the Office of State Archaeology. I think I'm still figuring a lot of that out as I've taken the job since July, but I would say that it's not a huge part of my time. I think it's what I consider the most important time is the sort of regulatory side, where I do get from certain towns that have regulations, I get a package in the mail, we're doing a subdivision, please give us a review. Again, these are things that don't get regulated at the state level, because that whole system is in place. But if there's not a trigger for state regulations, it's the municipal regulations that mean some towns have decided they should send stuff over my desk. So that's a small, and I go out to visit these sites if I can, and I write a letter, say, I think we're okay, I don't see any real concern, or it's like, I would really strongly recommend that you send some archaeologists to test before you get the area bulldozed. So, and that's it. And basically for my office, it's more of a recommendation. I don't have any legal authority. It's really up to the towns to decide what to do. The state has a little bit more regulatory authority. Even there it can be challenged and stuff. So that's a part of it. Answering emails from the public is a big aspect. I guess that's part of the public outreach. I get a lot of emails. I spend a lot of time on emails. I get a lot of email. That's a hard thing. It's not really just the public. A lot of it's just sort of coordination. There's a lot of meetings I go to. I'm on the Connecticut Historic Council. We meet monthly. We make decisions about historic preservation of mostly standing architectural structures, well outside my normal sort of specialization. But that's been quite interesting to take part in the sort of historic preservation process a little bit more formally too in Hartford. So I have those meetings regularly. And the public outreach I try to do, as often as I can. Nick was speaking weekly at least past job. And partly that helped bring in some money. If people could, they were making donations to the museum. I'm officially with the Connecticut State Museum of Natural History. So I've got some students right now. I'm spending a fair amount of time on collections issues that I've inherited. UConn has like 60,000 things in their anthropological collections, and there's right now 10,000 or so artifacts in a particular collection I'm focused on. I want to make sure those are correctly cataloged and bagged. And I'm in particular concerned about items that may be of interest to the tribes in the state that may have had ceremonial functions, things like the pipes. They need to know what we have. And some of this regulation happened in 1990 with MAGPRO, Native Americans Grave Protection and Repatriation Act. By 2000, any burial, certainly human remains, and then associated burial items, or what they call items of cultural patrimony, important cultural, traditional items, artifacts, were returned to the Pequots and Mohegans. It was only like 17 things that they said, oh, we'd like those back. I think there's a lot of other stuff, and I'm finding other things. We're getting collections in from guys who were active in digging in the 50s and 60s, where there were burials removed, and I'm finding as I go through boxes, there's like stuff, there's human remains, and then associated artifacts, beautiful things sometimes from like 2,500 years ago, that I want to make sure we get documented, but probably belong back in the ground. And that's where I also sit on the Native American Heritage Advisory Council. And that's a group that meets, I think, quarterly. And those are the things I bring to them. It's like, okay, I just found this new box. I'd like to have a little time to get this stuff analyzed, maybe. But then we'll set up a date for reburial. And we do repatriate and rebury artifacts now, sometimes. We did one in October recently.
What about New Canaan? Do you have any relationship with New Canaan? Should we have a relationship with you, or be checking anything with you?
To my knowledge, and I was kind of thumbing through the records that I have, and a lot of the things I need to do is figure out where everything is hiding in my office now that I've inherited. But it did not look to me like New Canaan has municipal regulations at the subdivision level or other developmental level. So yeah, I always strongly promote that. I think only about 40 or 50 towns out of the 169 in the state do have regulations. So you're not alone. It's a political thing. It can be challenging. Archaeology can get expensive, but the kind of review that we usually want to do, this preliminary, they call it phase 1 reconnaissance surveys, are manageable, even for someone doing a private subdivision. It could be a few $1,000s though, even for a simple review. So that's beyond my letter of recommendation. That's free. But then to actually do the archaeological background work, it can get expensive. And then anything beyond that can get terribly expensive. The work we did at Marshfield at an airport federal project, was I think got into the $800,000 range. Archaeology, it's a lot of human labor and a lot of lab costs and things like that too. So that's where I totally understand when towns are like, we can't do that because we don't expect them to do that at that level. Okay, people need to get out of here. Why don't we? Anyone who has any other questions can come up.
Oh, and don't forget that talk in a couple weeks with the women who wrote that wonderful book. Yeah, it's great.